You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about exciting, creative, and innovative ways of living. Produced in Santa Barbara, California, Sustainable World focuses on positive solutions to environmental challenges, solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics, earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe, how to plant a food forest, restorative design, or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned to Sustainable World Radio. I'm Jill Cloutier. So Clive Neeson, we're so lucky to have you on the phone, on Skype actually, from New Zealand. Can you tell us where you are right now and what are you looking at? Are you by a window and what do you see if you look out the window?
It's funny you should ask that, Phil. I'm actually looking out at a nice little surf break, which is at the front of my house, and it's only about 3 foot today, but it's very peaceful. There's no one here. And I'm sure once I'm done here, I'll be out there.
I'll keep it short, Clive. So tell us about your film, Last Paradise.
Last Paradise is a 45-year journey about the pioneering of adventure sports and travel. And so in that journey, we realize, of course, that the world has greatly changed over that time. And so therein lies a sub-story, a subliminal story. So by actually using the original footage in this film that we've got together, we've managed to show people just how the world was back then and how it is now in terms of a really fun journey where they participate in the journey over 45 years.
And could you tell our listeners about some of the amazing adventure sports? So if they're going to come see this film, what would they see on the big screen?
Yes, it is big screen. Actually, we used Peter Jackson's team, they're the same people that made Lord of the Rings, to actually get the quality as high as it is. And we used the best cinematography that was available over 45 years to tell that story, but also the best modern stunt people. And so the sports we cover, of course, is surfing, because a lot of this maverick spirit was rooted in surfing. And from then we move on to discovering the other sports, taking the surfboards to the mountains and discovering snowboarding. I should say not discovering it, actually inventing it. And that was in the mountains of Utah in America. And then we go into these other natural sports that evolved from it, which use nature's energy, such as kite surfing. And, of course, we cover the hang gliding, the mountains and the skiing. So that's where you get to experience glaciers that perhaps you've never seen before in your life, which don't exist anymore, by the way, through the hang gliding experience. So we pretty much go into all these adventure sports that are available today and their inception, their very beginnings.
Well, one of my favorite parts in the film was the windsurfer invented, was it a sink plunger that was put onto the board?
Yes, in the early 80s, which is actually later in the story, because the story starts in the 60s, when the weather all turned upside down here, we couldn't surf the waves, we found that we actually had to devise windsurfers as a way of surfing, which of course led to a big sport today in its own right. But it was very barbaric in the early days. And so we have the original footage of the first contraptions that were out there. But we've also got the latest and greatest too, in the biggest waves of the world, carving up on windsurfers. So, yeah, very basic from the beginning, but very funny, very humorous.
Yeah, the film made me laugh, and it's very moving and very humorous, which is such a great combo, Clive. Good job. One thing I wanted to ask you about, so you were saying you actually invented, so this is where snowboarding began, and some of the other things in the film, I know when, I think it's A.J. Hackett jumps off the Eiffel Tower. Was that one of the first incidences of bungee jumping?
Yes, it was, and AJ, whom was a friend of mine, was part of the story, of course. He's one of the 6 characters in the story, so we choose a character who is perhaps the pioneer in their particular sport. And AJ, like the rest, started off in the surfing community, who decided that when it came time to earning a bit of money and surviving, as we were quite remote, he was looking for some kind of invention that he could convert into a career. And so there's that part of the story where the particular characters decide that they're going to push it a bit further and try and make a bit of a commercial enterprise about what they're doing. And so his first validation, if you like, of what he discovered was to jump off the Eiffel Tower. And we see that all in original footage, but it's actually quite comedic. It's quite fun.
I loved what he said. Something about the good people of France. They won't want to put me in jail. That was a great scene. Very classic. So Clive, tell our listeners a bit about the film. So it is adventure sports and a lot of extreme sports, but there is this other side to the film, which is very, very important. And I think it goes hand in hand with the beautiful scenes of nature and people participating in nature. Could you tell our listeners about the other side, the more environmental message in the film?
Thanks. What we realized through the film is that it's these kids and these main characters who we get to know are probably about the age of 5, and they move through life, but they have no toys. They are remote. They're in New Zealand, in the wilderness, and they're basically, their playground is the wilderness. It was these particular characters, as you see through the film, that began to love the wilderness so much that they not only helped us create the film, but they have their own projects in restoration of the environment. And that is a key thing, that the kids who play in the wilderness today is protectors in the future. And that is basically the culmination of the film. So what we try to do in the film is not just show how it's important to have kids playing and communicating and actually loving the wilderness and the experience in the wilderness for the wilderness's own sake and future, but we also try and to build an appreciation and love for the wilderness itself through the film. And that's done by just beautiful, crisp cinematic experiences right from the beginning all the way through. As you see this, you see worlds that actually don't exist now, but you also see worlds that do exist, which no one has really been able to get to. And so we've tried to show their beauty in the same light that we saw them when we were kids and we discovered them. And before, of course, many of them disappeared. So we treat people to a great personal cinematic experience as if they're in the driver's seat, if you like, from kids all the way through to inventing these extreme sports.
It's amazing. And Clive, how would you say that lack, I read a few interviews that you've done, and you were talking about how you really didn't have a lot of toys, maybe you didn't watch TV. How did that lack contribute to the fullness of your childhood experience?
Well, I think because we had no toys and we had no television, we were so much playing outside. And in those days, inside was a controlled environment. It's where adults had the floor. It's where kids had to be seen and not heard. And we didn't have the toys. So the obvious place to go was out in the bush and invent things out in the bush. When we became teenagers, we carried on doing that. And we transferred it into the sports that we were starting to engage with, which was, in fact, in New Zealand, surfing was more being discovered or invented rather than being absorbed from other countries. And so we started from that platform to invent all these other things that we possibly could do because it was second nature. And of course, out of that also came with careers in science. And some of us were involved in science, and we brought in the electronics and the technology to help further these things. And that was the beginnings, of course, of surf prediction, wave prediction. It led to alternative forms of energy. And it also led to the sports such as bungee, where we used the electronics to actually be able to figure out the whole jump formula, and so on and so on. So there's a combination of science and, I guess, a love and familiarity with the wilderness that led to this. And all the way through, even to making the film, it was adversity. It was not having the equipment in those times. So you built your own cameras and you built your own water housings and you backpacked around the world. And you were always thinking of solutions outside the cube, if you like, because in New Zealand, we didn't have them. We didn't have things on the shelf. And so I think that was the flavor all the way through the film and making of the film. And so the film ended up being very original and very different because the components of it came out of that, what we call adversity and deprivation. It's always a good fruit that comes from that. When you have it all, there's no need to think about it. You just buy it off the shelf, and that's not a very good situation. We're moving more and more that way today. So as you see in the film, we're trying to point the way back to individual creativity and inventiveness. And of course, that is the way we're going to solve the problems we have today.
And Clive, do you see for children today compared to children, this was, I believe, in the 60s and 70s, what do you see a big difference in what kids are doing today in their free time and what you did?
Oh, absolutely. I think they're spending more time inside. They're probably not engaging with the wilderness and the outdoors so much. Absolute difference there.
What do you believe are the consequences of isolating children from nature?
Well, as we grow up and become politicians or select careers and so on, I think we make decisions based on how much we are influenced in our childhood. And I've noticed through all the way from our own lives to perhaps our Prime Minister or our former Prime Minister, that her indulgence in the outdoors as a kid really affected the crucial decisions she made when it came down to whether we should allow certain policies in respect to the environment, be it mining or be it industry or whatever. It was very foremost, and it goes all the way through life. As we become business people, our values are established by what we cherished as kids. And for us, the wilderness was number one. And so we'll always consider the fate of the wilderness in every decision we make, and any spare time we have, or whenever we are perhaps feeling like we have some spare time to give back to something, then it's usually the wilderness, because that is what gave us so much, and it's that we're trying to repay in our lives today, and also in this film. This film cost me $500,000, so basically it's my gift back to the wilderness for what it gave me and all the friends and the people I knew and the pioneers of extreme sports who today cherish it so much.
So it's very important, because a lot of children, when I do some environmental education as my job, part of another job I have, and we took children out to the Channel Islands a few weeks ago, and there was humpback whales and dolphins, and the kids were so excited. And one little boy, we had to turn the boat around because we saw a huge pile of helium balloons floating in the ocean. So we went back to turn the boat around and grab them out of the water. And this little boy, who was so excited, he screamed out, "I love science." He just couldn't contain himself anymore. And I've seen that transformation happen so many times when I take kids out in nature. So I understand what you're talking about, because many of them spend a lot of their time looking at screens.
Yes, that's right. In the film Last Paradise, we acknowledge that there's a lot of kids who can't even get out on these trips. So we'd like to, in the cinema, give them that experience of all ages. And we find that here, now we're starting to screen it theatrically in New Zealand, we have grandparents and parents and kids all turning up in one bunch to watch this film and all going away with a buzz after they see it. It's quite unusual to be cross-generational like that. And it's about giving people who can't get there that personal experience, and those who do get there on a regular basis, letting them see the best of it. Because Last Paradise does include the best waves, the biggest waves, the most extreme skiing as we come into the modern world. And even back then, there was some pretty extreme sort of things going on.
And you had a very interesting and unusual childhood and background. I think your parents were filmmakers who were filming in Africa when you were young. And you also had a friendship with Mickey Dora. And I'm curious about, maybe tell us a bit about your background and also what it was like to know Mickey Dora.
Well, the background was rather unusual, because my parents in the 50s were wildlife cinematographers in Africa. So we opted for New Zealand as opposed to going to any other country after, I think it was 1961, we came here. So they were one of the very few people that were actually filming in Africa back then. And I managed to restore their films for this movie. So they actually, so we begin the story in the movie is in Africa. So as we came to New Zealand, and it's an extraordinary place in New Zealand in the 60s, very, very isolated, and things were probably about 30 years behind the USA. And as you see in the film, there was a movement going on in USA, and it was involved around the Vietnam War, the counterculture movement, and New Zealand and Australia were involved in that. but it did have Americans and Californians looking outside of their own country. At the time, they were thinking everything wasn't right with their own politics and so on. And a very few of them actually looked towards Australia and New Zealand, and even fewer actually made it to New Zealand. And one of those was Mickey Dora. And so when he arrived here, he found a country in which absolutely no one knew him. And so we just happened to be the couple of kids at Raglan. This is the place he chose to live at, which ended up being our best surf break, I suppose, in New Zealand. It was just fortuitous that our father happened to decide that's where we should live, but it was before it was known as a surf spot. And so being non-threatened, I think Mickey Dora was very warm and approachable, and I think that's probably how it began, was just being able to surf with him as being one of the few surfers there, and him not being perhaps so reserved about things, and it was great. I mean, to us, he was a very old surfer. He was 40 years old. It was incredibly old. We'd never seen a surfer that old. The surfing here was the fancy of a few young teenagers, and that was it, just a handful of people. So to see someone 40 years old, that was intriguing in itself. Really, we did not really know who he was, where he came from. It's just that he was so old, that's all. But he was a gentleman, and he was very interesting, and he had travelled and we haven't. And as you see in the film, that's what triggers the whole travelling movement out of here in the film with the characters, is that Mickey Dora's tales and stories, both in the mountains and in the surf, are what had us thinking wide-eyed about the rest of the world, because it was pretty amazing here, but here we were seeing photos of other places, and we decided that's it. We're putting the camera in the backpack, water housing, and going to backpack around the world and go and discover these places he was talking about. And of course, you see in Last Paradise film, the footage actually came from that journey.
So, and also, didn't he make a prediction about how nature? He was saying how I think development was occurring, and I think in an article I read, you were saying that you had a hard time believing that at first.
Well, from our perspective in New Zealand, it was a very undeveloped country, extremely undeveloped. We didn't have anything like fast foods, had extremely old cars that you kept for about 30 years. And it really was stuck in the past. So talk about development. We'd never seen hardly any buildings over 2 stories high. We couldn't imagine what it was like in America even. He'd seen the other side of that. And I think he was on a mission to discover his own paradise. So he knew where it was going, but we couldn't relate to it. But as you see in Last Paradise film, is that we as the audience learn through the film what he's talking about. And actually, it's not just development, it's about the value of wealth. What is wealth? Because the standard paradigm is wealth is measured in money. And as we go from country to country, to Mexico, to Bali, and to the desert of Australia and Europe and so on, through the middle of this film, as we go on the big journey inspired by Mickey Dora, we start figuring out what wealth is. Each country, we discover something new. And that's a great educational tool. And I think many of us gone through that journey, but I just wanted to get that gelled into a film, that component of what is real wealth. And it's not what we're taught it is at all. And as you see at the end of the film, of course, there's a twist in the tale.
So, Clive, if you could talk a bit, the film to me has, and I think your life has probably been like this too. It's like you have your feet in 2 different camps. One is sports and nature, the other science. And I think you do a good job of showing where the 2 worlds kind of blend and connect. Could you talk a bit about your work as a physicist and scientist?
Yes. It was back in the 70s as a teenager that I became interested in science. And I saw science as being a great inroad into discovering those things that hadn't been discovered that I could use actually in sports and in travel and just solving day-to-day mysteries. So I saw it as a life's tool, if you like. But what was also very happening at that stage was the debate and actually a crisis in terms of energy, because people today may not remember that back in 73 we had a terrible gas crisis where we ran out of gas and we couldn't go anywhere. And science was promising solutions to this. It seemed to be the place where the solutions were, and an opportunity arose to actually get involved in energy and physics and electronic engineering, which I did, and fortunately it was with a great pioneer of those fields. And I turned it back into using it in the sports themselves and being able to explore with the sports and predict the waves in the sports and so on. But in the field of energy, which the film goes on to develop, we discover that there are alternative forms of energy that were being researched back then, which now are seen to be the promise for the future. And so it was a bit awkward back then, actually, living a life of a surfer with these very maverick, alternative and quite diverse, if you like, characters. And on the other hand, the other half of the day going back and joining this sort of scientific academic community. And you would never let one side know that you're involved with the other, because you're going to lose kudos straight away with that, you know. But as the years go on, they merged. That was 30 years later, 40 years later, they merged. It's okay to study science now and to be a surfer as well. It's quite normal. But back then it wasn't. You're either one or the other, and that never the two shall meet. But it was interesting because it actually gave me two perspectives. And in this particular film, you see that. So as things are evolving in the sports sector, in extreme sports, things are also evolving in science, but they're separate. But as we get to developing these into commercial enterprises, the two join up. So AJ's now employing the electronics and the physics and so on. And then as we get to the next stage, the next decade, they merge more. And so now we see sports science all over the place. But once again, Last Paradise is about pioneering. They started in two different camps. But it was neat to have a foot in both camps back then, to be able to put this film together and show both sides in the early stages and where they've come to.
Could you tell us a bit about Bruce Liley and how you met him? And he was a very creative scientist, is what I got from the movie.
Yes, Bruce Liley was actually appointed by Mark Oliphant, who was the colleague of Ernest Rutherford. And these were atomic physicists. And Bruce Liley's task was to discover a safe form of energy of high yield, which was fusion energy. And he did. And he did it very successfully. But due to the politics of the time, it wasn't given the money, I suppose, that it deserved, because fossil fuels were all too easy to progress with. At the time, I actually met Bruce Liley after he'd developed it in New Zealand and had the opportunity to work under him for 6 years, or study under him for 6 years as a physicist. So that became my career. Fusion energy became my career. And I saw fossil fuels taking its place, which was quite sad, and likewise it was for him. But it was really nice to be able to have met him there in an obscure place in Raglan where me and my brother were surfing. And as you see in Last Paradise film, that story's played out too. And how that went on to this great promise of the future for energy. And of course, for 30 years, it was all too easy with fossil fuels. And now we see that his invention has become the biggest scientific project in the world, the ITER project. And you see all this developing in the story parallel to the development of extreme sports. So that was difficult to make the story work like that, but I think in the end it does. And in fact, it's the energy in the scientific story that parallels the sports story that is actually liked by the extreme sports people. They really like that angle on it. And so what was a risk in the beginning turned out to be probably the strong part of the film.
And yeah, it's the first surf movie I've seen that talks about alternative energy. I thought that was an interesting marriage. Do you believe, and it sounds like it has been your life work, that fusion is a very viable, maybe will be a very viable form of energy in the future?
Well, it's been said by those who are most qualified, and I think the person that we have in our film, the character who speaks on that, is the most qualified in the world. He's the most achieved in fusion energy, head of the joint European tokamak, Barry Green. And they don't talk about if it becomes viable. They say when it becomes viable. So it's about money, focus, and intellect all being applied to this project as soon as possible. And that's the initiative now. So it is viable. It, in fact, Rutherford and Oliphant did achieve it in the laboratory. But, the true word viability means is it viable in terms of how much energy we get out of it and how much we put into it. But that is the goal that they're steadily working towards on a multinational project. And we see that all of the energy here is really coming from fusion because it's really just replicating what's happening on the sun.
It sounds like you really feel that science is important for critical thinking in young people and also for the next generation. Do you have anything else you want to add about the importance of science?
I think what is important is not just science, but the scientific method, that you approach every subject and every problem you have with a particular angle. And in physics, for example, that's what we call first principles. We go back to first principles where we go right back to what is totally undisputed and what is well-founded, and we build up all the way from that with logic and theory and experimental validation. And that's how we get to a secure point of conclusion. And that same method becomes habitual in your life. That's how you approach everything. Even if it's financial, you go right back to the solid foundation of what is absolutely true, what we know, and derive your own solution based on evidence and theory, validation. So there are many ways in which the scientific method can be used. And I think that the danger today is that we are becoming couch scientists, where we hear the conclusions or outcome of somebody's quasi-science, which is often being derived by wishful thinking, if you like. It hasn't been thought out from undisputed facts by scientific method. And once we come to learn that method through science, even if we learn nothing else about science and we learn the scientific method, then it can help us in our own lives through our own economics, our own way of looking at the world, our own way of questioning everything, whether it be the weather or whether we should go surfing or skiing that day, the political situation, whatever. It's a way of thinking, the scientific method. And so I think that, to me, has been the greatest value, because you can take that out into all other disciplines of life and utilize it. And science is not in one camp and nature in another. Probably bad politics has depopularized the fruit of science and abused the fruit of science in the past. But science itself is just our attempt to understand Mother Nature.
How can we, just in your opinion, do you have any ideas on how we can get children more interested in science and nature?
Well, I think it's been proved that the ability for kids to be able to see the wonder of the world and the universe heavily impacts on their choice of passions and careers, perhaps. And, of course, one of them is just playing in the wilderness. Another obscure one is ability to see the night sky, for example. They say that bad lighting in the world today is the reason why many kids are not studying science, because they don't look up as kids with a sense of wonder. And I can remember it when I was 5 years old, wanting to know what those worlds were up there and being so humbled and full of questions about what the universe was. And that drove me to science. So I think it's getting kids outside, playing outside, and being able to see the real the real nature and the real universe. If they're inside, they don't see that. What they see is the products of science, which is what the marketing world has given them. I mean, I've spent very little time working on playing with computers or even using computers, but I spent a lot of my time designing them and creating them. And that's the difference, you see. Kids today are believed to be masters of computers, but very few kids know what's under the keyboard. And that's the science, that's the physics. And a lot of parents, I think, make that mistake thinking that, if their children are on the computer, they're playing on the computer, they're really learning about technology, but really it's a lot of button pushing going on. There's not a lot of understanding about how the physics under the keyboard actually works, the electronics and so on. To take an obscure example,
And that's one thing too, Clive. I noticed in your film, you guys were actually taking risks when you were young. You probably were getting injured when you were young. Did you have a lot of bruises? And it was okay back then to actually get bruised, right? And take some risks as a child.
Oh, it was okay to do that. It was also allowed. Kids were allowed to do that. And if you got bruised, then you learned the lesson, and it wasn't your parents that took the brunt of that. But it gave you a very close familiarity with the laws of nature, how far you can push yourself and what the consequences are. And if you're pioneering extreme sports, it's a great asset. To come in without that knowledge of the consequences and that feel for the boundaries and the safe boundaries, AJ could not have developed the bungee jump, for example. And so you can see how that not only that freedom to play in the outdoors, but that freedom and willingness to get bruised and bumped around without any soliciting was just part of the education that set these guys up to become the pioneers of these extreme sports, adventure sports.
Well, Clive, your film is amazing. It's 45 years of footage. What inspired you, or what prompted you to hold on to that footage? Did you always know you were going to make a movie, or was it something that you just kept and viewed for yourself? How did this film come about?
Well, as I said before, my parents were wildlife cinematographers in Africa. But by 15 years old, I bought an old camera and renovated it. And so I had my own camera by that stage. And I think by 17 years old, I had an idea that what was happening here in New Zealand and what we were about to explore in other countries and discover there was something that would be very unusual and one day would be very different and very intriguing. So I had an idea of a movie. I think about the same time at Nikki Dora, I had this is what I'm going to do with my filming. I'm going to go out and film these journeys and these discoveries of these new paradises in the early 70s, late 60s, and I'm going to make a movie eventually, which is concluded by the way the world turns out. Because we already had back then in the early 70s, we already had this kind of vision about the way the world might go, and I wanted to know if it was going to work out that way. And I figured, well, if I film it now, it's going to be a great story when it is finished. So that's why 4 years ago, when I was working down at Peter Jackson's studios down there, I had this opportunity to take all my film and also all the film of those people I knew around Australia and New Zealand that had filmed very high quality back then on the subject of travel and sports pioneering, extreme sports pioneering. And just hundreds, probably about 20 hours of film we restored into big screen quality and then made the film out of that when we got a story running through it. So the story was conceived when I was 17 years old. I'm now 55 years old. So I think it's been the longest gestation period of any film. And I'm glad to say that it has kind of turned out the way we expected, with a nice twist at the end, and it's made for a very strong story supported by, as you saw in the movie, almost all the story is actually original footage. It's not talking heads. This is not a talking heads documentary. Sure, we have the main six pioneers of these sports telling the story, but you're not looking at their faces. You're looking at the real thing in big screen quality. So Last Paradise has become a film which preserves archivally some great footage as well as the story of how it all began.
So, Clive, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, I'm just so pleased that Last Paradise film is actually playing in your magnificent Arlington Theatre in Santa Barbara. I've always loved Santa Barbara, and I had no other reason to go there except to surf in the past. But to be able to make an appearance at this a special event on the 20th is just going to be a fantastic culmination of creating the film Last Paradise.
Last Paradise will be showing October 20th at 7 p.m. at the Arlington Theater in downtown Santa Barbara. And this is a benefit for the Santa Barbara City College Center for Sustainability. And I do believe, Clive, that you will be there. You just said you'll be attending. And will there be a Q&A afterwards for people to get more information from you?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. The film has many handles on it, has many, points of intrigue, and our Q&A audience in the New Zealand Film Festival, which toured all our cities here, all our towns, actually drew the biggest audience of the whole festival. And so it's because of the multifaceted aspect of Last Paradise film that I think it intrigues on many levels, and so the Q&As become actually quite an event in themselves. So do make it to the Q&A session after and bring all your questions.
That is great. And this event is co-sponsored by Santa Barbara Surfrider Foundation. So, this has been a wonderful time with you today, Clive. And do you want to share any last words with our listeners?
Well, the film Last Paradise was made intentionally to appeal to all age groups. And I know that many environmental films, for example, do tend to play to a captive audience. But this one here, you'll get hooked along with a fun story about the whole adventure travel extreme sports journey, how it began. And underneath that, you'll learn a heck of a lot about the other aspects. Whatever age you are, you have fun.
So, Clive, if any listeners want to contact you or find out more information on the film, where can they go online?
All the screenings of the film around the world, at the moment it's just festivals, will be published on our website, www.lastparadisefilm.com. And all the information about the film, the synopsis, and the trailer you can watch at lastparadisefilm.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Clive Neeson. And I hope you have a great afternoon surfing.
Thanks very much. I look forward to seeing you at Santa Barbara.
Thanks, Clive.
Cheers, Jill.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. For more information or to hear our other podcasts or interviews, visit www.sustainableworldradio.com. Sustainable World Radio is produced by Jill Cloutier. Music by Dana Lyons. Thanks for listening.